He had survived ambushes in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. He had pulled wounded men through enemy fire, made life-or-death calls in seconds, and walked away from things that broke other people permanently. But on a snow-blinded mountain road outside Hollow Ridge, Colorado, Grant Mercer made the one decision that would crack open the life he had so carefully sealed shut, and he almost didn't make it. He almost kept driving. A 7-year-old girl was waiting for him at home. The storm was getting worse, and whatever was buried beneath that snow on the shoulder of Route 9 was none of his business. He almost kept driving. He didn't. If this story already has you curious, you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that mountain road. The county plow truck had no business being on Route 9 at 9:40 in the evening, and Grant Mercer had no business driving it. His shift had ended at 6. He'd stayed 3 hours late because Dale Hutchins, who was supposed to take the mountain run, called in with a bad back, and because Grant had a difficult time saying no when the alternative was someone else doing a job he didn't trust them to do correctly. That was something his late wife, Catherine, had called his most annoying quality. You think you're the only person who can do anything right. She hadn't been entirely wrong. Outside the truck's windshield, the storm had gone from serious to mean. Kind of Colorado blizzard that didn't announce itself politely, it just arrived and started doing damage. Snow came sideways in the headlights, not falling so much as hurling itself at everything in its path. Temperature on the dash read 14 degrees. Wind gusts were lifting the plow's blade and shuddering the whole rig every 30 seconds. Grant had the radio on low, not listening to it, his eyes doing what they always did in conditions like this, scanning. It was an old habit, one that predated his time with the county road department by almost a decade. In the SEALs, they'd called it threat assessment, which sounded formal and military. What it really meant was, your eyes never stop moving, your brain never stops processing, and you train yourself to notice the thing that doesn't fit before the rest of you catches up. He was doing that now without thinking about it. Left shoulder, right shoulder, road surface, overhang above, left shoulder again. That's when he saw it. Just a flicker, a reddish smear in the snow on the right side of the road, maybe 30 yards ahead, half up the embankment and half buried. He didn't know what it was. His brain filed it in the category of doesn't fit, and he was already lifting his foot off the accelerator before he consciously decided to. He pulled the plow to the shoulder and sat for a moment with the engine running, wipers hammering back and forth. Reflector post, he thought. Probably just a reflector post knocked sideways. He thought about Ellie, 7 years old, staying tonight with his neighbor Mrs. Paulson 3/4 of a mile down the access road, the same arrangement every time Grant pulled an evening run. Mrs. Paulson was 81 and completely capable and genuinely enjoyed Ellie's company, but Ellie had been fighting a cough all week. Nothing serious, just the kind of winter cough kids got. He'd told her he'd be home by 10. It was 9:43. Grant sat there with his hands on the wheel. Then he put the truck in park, grabbed his flashlight and his coat, and got out. The wind hit him like a door swinging open on a freezer. He ducked his head and walked toward the embankment, sweeping the flashlight beam left and right. The snow was mid-thigh in places off the road surface. His boots punched through a crust of ice with every step, and he felt the cold working into his legs immediately, the kind of cold that meant business. He almost missed it. The front end of the SUV had gone nose first into the embankment. The rear end was slightly elevated, the right rear taillight catching just enough of his beam to throw back that dim reddish glow. Another 6 feet, and it would have gone through the guardrail and down the ravine. The whole vehicle was half buried, snow packed around the wheel wells and up over the hood, and if Grant hadn't been running his eyes along that shoulder the way he always did, he would have driven right past it. He pushed through the snow and got to the driver's side door. The woman inside wasn't moving. Grant pulled the door handle. Locked. He shone his light through the window and got a clear look. She was young, he'd find out. Later she was 30, though she looked younger unconscious. Dark hair plastered across her face. Her head was tilted back against the headrest at an angle that looked wrong, and her lips had taken on the pale, bluish quality that Grant recognized immediately and did not like at all. She was wearing a wool coat, good quality, the kind that cost money, but her hands were bare and her fingers had gone white. The engine was off. The heater was off. The car had been here long enough for the engine to die and the interior temperature to drop to whatever hell was happening outside. Grant tried the door again. Then he stepped back, unzipped his coat, and pulled his thermal undershirt up around his elbow, formed a fist, and put it through the rear side window. He'd broken windows before. It hurt every time regardless of how you prepared for it, and this time was no different. He pulled his arm back, shook out his hand, reached through, and unlocked the door. He got in beside her. Okay, he thought. Okay, let's figure out what we're working with. He checked her breathing first. Shallow but there. Pulse in her throat slow, which concerned him. No obvious head wound. No blood he could see, but she'd taken some kind of impact. The airbag had deployed and was now deflated across the steering wheel. He moved her hair out of her face carefully, checking pupils with the flashlight as best he could. They responded. Not as fast as he'd like, but they responded. Hypothermia setting in. Possibly a concussion. Needed warmth and needed it before too much longer. Grant looked out at the storm, looked at the road, and ran his options. Cell service out here in the blizzard was non-existent. He'd already tried his own phone on 3 different parts of this route tonight and gotten nothing. The county radio in the plow could reach dispatch, but dispatch couldn't get an ambulance up Route 9 in these conditions in anything under 2 hours. He knew the road better than anyone. He'd been plowing it for 4 years. The Clearwater Hospital was 43 minutes in good weather. Tonight it might as well have been Mars. His own cabin was 8 minutes from here. Grant made the calculation the same way he'd made 100 others in situations. With no good options, he chose the least bad one and committed to it completely. He went back to the plow, pulled his emergency kit, and every blanket he had 2 wool ones he kept for exactly this kind of situation, and got back to the SUV. He wrapped her hands first, then got the blankets around her shoulders and torso, and then he did the thing that he would have a hard time explaining to anyone who hadn't done it before. He picked her up. She wasn't small, 5'6", maybe 5'7", and not the kind of slight that the word unconscious sometimes implied. She had weight. Getting her out of the vehicle while she was completely limp, in the dark, in the wind, with the snow coming sideways, it required the kind of physical effort that reminded Grant. His body was 37 years old and had been used hard. He got her out. He got her over his shoulder in a modified carry that kept her airway clear. And he walked. 8 minutes in the truck. On foot through the drifts, carrying a person, it was 24. Grant had done longer movements with heavier loads in worse conditions. That wasn't what made this hard. What made this hard was that halfway there she started shivering, which was actually a good sign medically, but meant she was starting to regain some consciousness. And twice she said something he couldn't quite make out one word, maybe a name, and he had the uncomfortable experience of carrying a stranger who was not entirely absent, not entirely present, and in either case completely dependent on him. He didn't talk to her. He didn't know why, except that it felt wrong to pretend a relationship they didn't have. Instead, he just kept moving. The cabin came up through the trees the way it always did, solid in squares and lit by the single porch light he always left on. He got the door open with his shoulder, carried her inside, and set her down on the couch as carefully as he could manage. The cabin was warm. He kept the wood stove running whenever he wasn't home, because the pipes couldn't take a cold snap, and the insulation in the north wall had always been inadequate. He built the fire up higher, and then went through the same assessment he'd done, in the car breathing, pulse pupils, extremities. Better already. The shivering was working, her color was slightly improved, and when he checked her fingers, they were starting to pink up. He got her coat off, got her shoes. Her pants were wet through from the snow, and he stood there for a moment looking at the ceiling before he made the pragmatic decision that this was not a situation for hesitation, and got her into dry clothes, a pair of his flannel sleep pants, drawn tight with the cord, and one of his larger flannels. Kept his eyes on what he was doing and nothing else. When it was done, he covered her with the heavy quilt from his bedroom and pulled a chair up beside her. Then he sat down. He was sweating through his base layer, despite the cold he'd brought in with him. His hands had stopped shaking, they'd been shaking in the truck, Not before. He'd noticed it only after he'd set her down, and he became aware that he was very tired. He checked her again at the 30-minute mark. Her color was markedly better. Her breathing had deepened. At 40 minutes, she moved. Not much. Just her head, turning toward the fire, and then slowly her eyes opened. She looked at the ceiling first, then at the fire. Then at Grant, sitting in the chair 3 feet away, and her face went through about 4 expressions in 2 seconds: confusion, alarm, confusion again, something more careful. "Hey," Grant said. He didn't move. "You're okay. You had a crash on Route 9. I brought you here." She stared at him. "Where is here?" she said. Her voice was rough and low, like it had been somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. "My cabin, about 8 miles from where your car went off the road." She looked at the room, at the fire, at herself. He watched her process the flannel shirt with an expression he couldn't quite read. "My clothes," she said, "were soaked through. You were going hypothermic." He kept his voice level. "I kept my eyes where they needed to be and nowhere else. For what it's worth." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said, and something in her posture shifted, not entirely relaxed, but less ready to fight. "I'm Grant Mercer. I work for the county road department. I was running the plow on Route 9 when I spotted your car." "Camille," she said. Then, like it was something she said automatically, "Camille Arden. You want water?" "I've got water and I've got coffee." "Coffee's from this afternoon, so it's not great." "Water," she said. He got up, filled a glass, brought it back. She sat up slowly, and he saw her wince, her hand going to the side of her head. "You airbagged," he said. "Probably going to have a headache for a day or two." "Any ringing in your ears?" "Some. Neck feel okay? Any numbness in your arms or hands?" She moved her fingers, flexed her wrists experimentally. "No, just cold. That'll pass." She drank most of the water in one go and then held the glass in both hands like she wanted something to hold on to. Her eyes moved around the room again slowly, taking things in. Grant let her. He'd learned a long time ago that the first thing a person in shock needed was not information or questions or sympathy. They needed a few minutes just to exist in a space that wasn't dangerous. "My phone," she said. "If it was in the car, I didn't grab it. My radio in the truck could reach county dispatch, but getting anyone up that road tonight." He shook his head. "There's no cell service out here anyway. Storm took out the towers or the signal's just gone." "Happens." She looked at him. He couldn't tell if she was angry or just processing. "So we're stuck," she said, "until the storm breaks enough for travel." "Yeah. The road I came in on is already drifted. I'm not trying to take the truck back out tonight." He paused. "There's a bedroom, my daughter's room. She's not here tonight. You can have it. I'll sleep out here. You have a daughter. 7 years old. She's at a neighbor's." Camille was quiet for a moment. "How old are you?" she asked, and it came out like she hadn't fully planned to say it. 37. "You carried me here," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "It's about 8 minutes in the truck, longer on foot." She looked at him. "That's not what I asked." "I know." He picked up his coffee mug from the end table, looked into it, set it back down. "You needed to be somewhere warm. The cabin was closer than anything else." She was quiet again. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was doing what it had been doing all night, working at the edges of the structure, looking for gaps. The cabin had gaps, but it had survived worse. "Thank you," she said finally. Stopping. "Don't thank me yet," Grant said. "Storm's not supposed to break until Thursday at the earliest." Camille looked at the frosted window, at the absolute darkness and flying white beyond it, and something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of understanding how serious this actually was. "Tuesday," she said. "Yeah," Grant said. "It is." He showed her to Ellie's room around midnight. He'd changed the sheets. Ellie's were covered in cartoon stars, which seemed like maybe not the right thing for a technology CEO. A title Grant had found on the business card in her coat pocket while she was still unconscious. Something he'd done to find out who she was and whether he needed to be making calls on her behalf. Camille Arden, CEO Arden Systems, a Denver address. He'd never heard of Arden Systems. He looked it up, no signal, obviously. He'd look it up later. She stood in the doorway of Ellie's room for a moment, looking at the drawings taped to the wall. Ellie drew constantly. Everything she saw, the mountains and the trees and the cabin, and Grant in various postures of doing things around the property. Grant was often shown with a shovel, which seemed accurate. "Your daughter drew these?" Camille said. "All of them." "She's good. I know," he said. "She gets it from her mother." He hadn't meant to add that part. It came out the way things did sometimes, without permission. Camille turned to look at him, but didn't say anything. "Bathroom's the second door on the left," Grant said. "There's a spare toothbrush in the cabinet, still in the package. Towels on the rack. Okay. Knock if something's wrong. I'll be on the couch." He pulled the door partway closed and went back out to the living room. He rebuilt the fire, turned off the light, and lay down on the couch with the blanket Camille had been using, which still held some of the warmth from when she was wrapped in it. He looked at the ceiling for a long time. He thought about Ellie. He thought about the storm. He thought about the way the taillight had just barely caught his beam 6 inches lower, and he would have missed it completely, driven right past. And by morning, whatever was under that snow would have been impossible to reach. He thought about the word Thursday. 2 days. Maybe more. He'd had house guests exactly once since Catherine died, and that had been his brother-in-law the summer after the funeral, and that had been 2 of the worst weeks of his life for reasons that had nothing to do with hospitality. This was different. This was a stranger. He knew nothing about her except her name, and that she ran a technology company, and that she was alive because he'd noticed something that didn't fit on a road he knew better than most people knew their own living rooms. He didn't know what that meant. He didn't try to figure it out. Closed his eyes. Outside, the storm kept going. Grant woke at 5:13 because that's when he always woke, storm or no storm, and for about 4 seconds he lay on the couch in the gray dark thinking everything was normal. Then he heard the wind working at the north wall and remembered. He sat up slowly. His back was doing the thing it did when he slept somewhere. Other than his own bed, a deep, grinding complaint from the spot between his shoulder blades, where a piece of shrapnel had lived for 6 weeks before a surgeon in Germany removed it. He rolled his neck, stood, and went to the window. Storm hadn't broken. If anything, it had gotten more serious overnight, the kind of commitment a Colorado blizzard made when it decided it wasn't leaving. Treeline was barely visible through the white. The truck was a rounded shape in the driveway, snow past the running boards, the plow blade completely buried. Put his hand flat on the glass and felt the cold radiating through it like a living thing. He built the fire back up, put water on for coffee, and stood in the kitchen in his socks, listening to the cabin settle against the wind. There was a sound in the north wall. He didn't like a low, occasional groan that wasn't the normal sound of the structure breathing. He'd been meaning to reinforce the roof supports on that side since September. He'd gotten to the hardware store twice and talked himself out of the project both times, because the estimates kept coming back higher than he had ready money for, and he kept telling himself he'd get to it in the spring. He was thinking about that sound when he heard Camille's door open. She came out in the flannel pants and his oversized shirt, hair still tangled from sleep, one hand trailing along the hallway wall like she needed something to hold on to. She stopped when she saw him. "Morning," he said. She looked at the window. At the snow. She didn't say anything for a moment. "It's worse," she said finally. "Yeah." Came into the kitchen and stood beside the counter, and he could see her recalibrating the way a person did when they woke up still holding the faint hope that the situation they'd fallen asleep inside had somehow resolved itself, and then found it waiting for them exactly where they'd left it. She looked like someone who was not accustomed to situations that didn't respond to her. "Coffee?" he said. "Please." He poured 2 mugs. She took hers and wrapped both hands around it, the same thing she'd done with the water glass the night before, that need to hold on to something, and looked out the window at the buried truck. "What time does the storm break?" she asked. "The estimate I had last night was Thursday." "Could shift." "Shift which direction?" "Either one. Weather up here does what it wants." She was quiet. He could see her working through something, the way people did when they were used to having all the variables in front of them, and someone had taken most of the variables away. "My company," she said. "There are people who will be trying to reach me." "I know. There's nothing I can do about that until we get signal or the road opens." He kept his voice even, not unkind, just honest. "I've got a radio that can reach county dispatch on a clear frequency. I'll try it this morning." They can relay a message if they get through. She nodded slowly. Okay, you hungry? She seemed to think about it, like hunger was a thing she had to consciously check in with. Yes, she said, like she was mildly surprised by the answer. He made eggs. It was what he had the most of 24 in the refrigerator because Ellie went through eggs at a pace that genuinely amazed him. He scrambled them with some cheese and cut bread off the loaf he'd baked on Sunday, and they ate at the kitchen table without talking much. Camille ate like someone who'd forgotten they were hungry until the food was in front of them, and then remembered all at once. How long have you lived out here? She asked. 4 years. Before that, he considered how much of that answer to give. Different places. I was in the Navy for 9 years. After that, Denver for a while. Then we moved up here. We, she said, and then seemed to hear herself. Sorry. You don't have to, my wife Catherine. We moved here when Ellie was 2. He picked up his mug. Catherine died about 4 years ago. Little less. I'm sorry, Camille said, and said it the way people did when they actually meant it, rather than when they were just filling in the expected space. She had an aneurysm, Grant said. No warning. She was 33. He set the mug down. I'm not going to make this a whole thing. I just wanted you to know why it's the 2 of us here, and not 3. Camille nodded. She looked at her plate. I understand more than you might think. He waited. She didn't elaborate right away. She pushed a small piece of egg around with her fork. My brother, she said finally. Marcus, he died 3 years ago. Car accident. She said it the same way Grant said things he'd said many times flat, practiced. The version of the sentence he'd worn smooth so it didn't cut anymore. He was 34. Grant didn't say he was sorry. People said that, and it meant nothing after the first 50 times. Instead, he said, were you close? He was the only person who could make me slow down. She almost smiled, but it didn't quite get there. He used to call me every Sunday and make me tell him one thing I'd done that week that wasn't work. Just one thing. The almost smile faded. After he died, I worked more. Yeah, Grant said, that tracks. She looked at him. After Catherine, I worked more too. Just different kind of work. I was fixing things constantly. The cabin, the truck, anything I could put my hands on. He gestured vaguely at the room. Ellie was 2. She needed things fixed. Everything needed fixing. He paused. Kept my hands busy. That's what it was. They looked at each other for a moment across the table, and Grant had the strange, slightly uncomfortable sensation of having said more to this woman in 12 hours than he'd said to most people in a year. He got up and took the plates to the sink. He reached dispatch on the radio at 7:45. The signal was poor and kept cutting, but he got enough through. There was a woman stranded at his location. Her vehicle was on the shoulder of Route 9 near mile marker 31. She was safe and uninjured. She had a company in Denver that would be looking for her. Could they relay? There was static, then a voice confirming they'd try, then more static, then nothing. The best I can do, he told Camille. It's something, she said. He spent the morning on the maintenance that a storm this size required. He checked the generator behind the cabin, made sure the fuel line hadn't iced, cleared the worst of the accumulation off the generator housing. He checked the woodpile under the lean-to and did a rough calculation of how long he could sustain the interior temperature at the rate the fire was burning. He had enough. He had more than enough. He always kept extra, because one winter, 2 years ago, he'd come close to running short, and he hadn't made that mistake again. Camille, inside, appeared to be figuring out what to do with herself. He could see her through the window. When he came around the side of the cabin on his second pass, she was moving around the kitchen, opening cabinets, looking at things. She wasn't snooping, not exactly. She looked like someone who needed to be useful and was trying to locate an entry point. When he came back inside, she was doing dishes. He stopped in the doorway. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said, and kept doing them. He took off his coat and boots and hung them by the door. Stacked the dried dishes to one side with a precision that suggested she'd organized things by shape without consciously deciding to, which told him something about how her brain worked. The generator's good, he said. Woodpile is fine. We're not in danger of anything critical. He meant it as information, not reassurance, but he could see her shoulders drop a fraction of an inch when he said it. Good, she said. She turned off the tap and dried her hands on the dish towel he kept on the oven handle. And then she stood in the kitchen and looked at the window again, with that same expression she'd had at breakfast, the one that was doing math, on a problem that didn't have a clean solution. "Tell me something to do," she said. She stopped. "I don't do well with nothing to do. I noticed." She gave him a look that was approximately 60% irritated and 40% amused. He found that ratio somewhat easier to deal with than whatever complicated thing her face had been doing at breakfast. "Firewood," he said. "The indoor rack is getting low. I usually keep it stacked to here." He indicated a point on the wall with his hand. "Stacks just outside the back door, under the lean-to. Box gloves are on the shelf above the coats." She put on the box gloves and hauled firewood for 40 minutes without being asked to stop. She wasn't efficient at first, she loaded too few pieces and made too many trips, but she figured out the optimization without him saying anything, and by the end she was moving at a decent pace. She stacked it neatly, which he'd learned not to assume people would do. He was replacing a hinge on the cabinet above the refrigerator that had been sitting slightly wrong for 2 months when she came back in. "Done," she said. He looked over his shoulder. "Good. Thank you." She hung the box gloves back on the shelf with a precision that was either habit or personality. Ellie came home at noon. That wasn't the plan. Plan had been to leave her with Mrs. Paulson until the road cleared, which was still Grant's strong preference. But Mrs. Paulson called on the radio she had her own unit, a relic from 30 years ago that still worked perfectly to say that Ellie was asking to come home every 20 minutes and had been since breakfast, and that Mrs. Paulson was also running a little low on certain supplies and wouldn't mind if Grant was able to come down. Grant made the drive in the truck the road to Mrs. Paulson's was flat and only half a mile, and he'd plowed it twice already, and came back with Ellie bundled in the front seat. She talked the entire way home, the way she always did, a continuous stream of information about what she and Mrs. Paulson had done and eaten and watched and talked about, delivered at the pace of someone who had been storing it up and was now releasing it all at once. Grant answered when there were gaps, which were rare. He was trying to figure out how to explain what she was going to find when they got back. "Ellie," he said, as they turned up the driveway, "there's someone at the cabin." She stopped mid-sentence. "Who, a woman? Her car crashed in the storm last night on Route 9. I brought her here because there was nowhere else to bring her, and she needed to get warm." Ellie absorbed this. "Is she okay?" "She's fine now. She's going to be here for a couple of days until the road clears." "What's her name?" "Camille." Ellie said the name quietly to herself like she was testing it. "Is she nice?" "I don't know yet," Grant said honestly. "She seems like it." Ellie accepted this and went back to telling him about Mrs. Paulson's cat, which had knocked something off a shelf in the night and caused considerable drama. When they came through the cabin door, Camille was on the couch, with a book she'd found on Grant's shelf, one of the battered paperback thrillers he kept for long evenings. She looked up when the door opened. Ellie stopped inside the doorway and looked at her. The two of them looked at each other for a moment. Grant had been in situations where the tension in a room was something you could measure, and this was one of them, but it was a different kind of tension than he knew, not hostile, just careful. Two people who didn't have any shared context, trying to figure out what the context was. "Hi," Ellie said. "Hi," Camille said. She set the book down. "You must be Ellie. My dad told you about me?" "He's at 7. Ellie nodded seriously. 7.5. The half matters. Something crossed Camille's face that might have been the first real version of a smile Grant had seen from her, not the almost ones from breakfast. "That's fair," she said. "The half does matter." Ellie came further into the room, still watching Camille with the direct, unfiltered assessment that only children and certain military personnel had the capacity for. Grant had never been able to decide whether it was charming or deeply unsettling. "Probably both. That's my favorite spot," Ellie said. She was looking at the couch cushion Camille was sitting on, the one at the end nearest the fire. "I'm sorry," Camille said immediately and started to shift. "It's okay," Ellie said quickly. "You can sit there. I'm just telling you." A pause. "That's generous of you," Camille said.
"I know."
Ellie went to the kitchen table, opened her backpack, and took out her drawing pad, her colored pencils, and what appeared to be a small owl figurine that Grant didn't recognize and assumed was something she'd acquired from Mrs. Paulson. He watched this from the doorway, Camille watched it from the couch. Ellie organized her materials with the deliberate care of a person who had very specific systems and very strong feelings about those systems, and then she began drawing and did not look up. The room settled into a quiet that was, somehow, not uncomfortable. The afternoon was something Grant hadn't expected and didn't know what to do with. Not bad, just unfamiliar. Ellie drew. Camille read, or tried to. Grant noticed she read the same page twice, then a third time, then looked at the fire for a while. He worked on a small repair project in the back of the cabin, replacing some damaged insulation in the space behind the water heater, the kind of task that needed doing, and that he could do quietly. Around 3 o'clock, he heard Ellie's voice from the living room. "Do you know what this animal is?" He stopped working and listened. "Let me see," Camille said, a pause. "It looks like a wolverine." "It's a fisher cat," Ellie said, with the gentle correction of someone who has knowledge and is sharing it purely as information, not scoring points. "They're related. They're both mustelids. You know what mustelids are?" "I know what most animals are. I have a book." A brief silence. "Do you like animals?" "I grew up with dogs," Camille said. "2 of them. Labs. We can't have a dog," Ellie said. "My dad is gone too much." Grant winced slightly at this. It was accurate. He'd promised Ellie they'd revisit the question when she was older, and he had a different work schedule, and he'd been revisiting it in theory for 2 years. "That's responsible of him," Camille said. "Some people get dogs before they're ready." "That's what he says too." Ellie was quiet for a moment. "What do you do? For work?" "I run a company. We make software. Programs for computers." "Is that interesting sometimes?" A pause that Grant read as genuine reflection rather than evasion. "Honestly, it used to be more interesting than it is right now." "Why?" "I think I stopped paying attention to the parts I like and just kept doing the parts that needed doing." Ellie seemed to consider this. "My dad says that's easy to do with anything." "Your dad sounds like he's right about a lot of things." "He is," Ellie said, in a tone that carried no irony whatsoever. "Don't tell him I said that. He already knows, and it makes him annoying." Grant pressed his forehead against the wall behind the water heater and stayed very still. From the living room, he heard Camille make a sound he hadn't heard from her before. A short, actual laugh. Dinner was canned soup and cornbread, which was the meal Grant defaulted to when conditions made complexity impractical. He made enough for 3. Ellie set the table without being asked, which she did about 40% of the time, and she set 3 places without any visible deliberation, as if having 3 people at the table were already a normal and established fact. They ate. Ellie talked about the Fisher cat drawing, and then about a TV nature documentary she'd been watching at Mrs. Paulson's, and then about a question she'd been thinking about regarding whether mountains were alive in any scientific sense. "They change," she said, laying this out with the logical structure of someone building an argument. "They grow and shrink. Some of them have water inside them." "Does that make them alive?" "Alive has a specific definition in biology," Camille said. "It has to do with cells and metabolism and reproduction." "Mountains don't reproduce," Ellie said, clearly having already considered this objection. "Right, but neither do mules. And mules are alive." Pause. "That's a really good point," Camille said. Ellie looked pleased. "I know. I've been thinking about it for a week." Grant ate his soup and let the conversation happen around him. And the thing he kept noticing was that Camille didn't perform interest in Ellie the way some adults did, that particular register of exaggerated enthusiasm that children saw through immediately and that Ellie specifically had no patience for. She talked to her the way she'd talk to anyone she was genuinely curious about. Asked follow-up questions. Pushed back when she disagreed, which Ellie responded to better than agreement. After dinner, Ellie helped clear the table and then announced she was going to read in her room. Paused at the hallway entrance. "Camille," she said, "when you go back, are you going to remember what mustelids are?" "I'm going to remember that conversation for a long time," Camille said. Ellie appeared satisfied with this answer, which was the right one. She went to her room and closed the door. Grant and Camille sat with their coffee at the table. "She's remarkable," Camille said. "She has her moments," he said. "She also has phases where she leaves her socks on the kitchen counter and refuses to explain why. All the best people are complicated." Grant wrapped his hands around his mug. She likes you, he said. She doesn't always like new people. I like her, Camille said, simply. Outside, the wind was doing its work. Cabin answered with the usual complaints, the rattle of the north window, the occasional moan from the wall, and also the other sound, the lower one that Grant had been thinking about since morning. He listened to it now. What is that? Camille asked. He'd thought she hadn't noticed. North wall. The roof supports on that side have been on my list for a while. What does that mean in a storm like this? It means I'm going to keep an eye on it. She looked at him. He could see her evaluating whether that answer was complete or whether it was the version of the answer he'd given her to avoid worry. He let her evaluate. What does keeping an eye on it look like? She said. Listening. If the sound changes, I act. He set his mug down. I've been in this cabin through bad storms. I know what it sounds like when it's fine and what it sounds like when it's not. She held his eyes for a moment. And right now it sounds like a cabin that's working hard but doing okay. He paused. But I want to be honest with you. I'm not going to tell you there's nothing to watch. She seemed to respect this more than she'd have respected a cleaner answer. She nodded once and looked at the window. They sat for a while without talking. The fire did what fires did. The storm pushed and the cabin held. Can I ask you something? Camille said. Go ahead. When you were a SEAL, did you always know the right call? In bad situations? He thought about it. No. But you made the call anyway. You make the best call you have the information for, and you stay committed to it, he said. Doubt is fine before. Doubt in the middle gets people killed. She was quiet for a moment. I make decisions differently, she said. In my work. I model every scenario, run projections, bring in 3 different advisors. She paused. And I still second-guess myself constantly afterward. Different kind of stakes, he said. Are they? She looked at her hands. 300 employees. Their salaries, their families, their mortgages. Every call I make has a downstream. She looked up. Stakes just look different. He thought about that. Fair point. She looked down again. Marcus used to tell me I was better at deciding than I thought I was. That the second guessing was just what caring looked like in me. Her voice had changed slightly on his name, not breaking, just shifting texture. I thought that was something brothers said. Maybe, Grant said. But I've met people who don't second-guess themselves on decisions that matter, and it's not a quality I'd recommend. She looked at him. Something in her face was less guarded than it had been that morning. You're easier to talk to than I would have expected, she said. Given, she gestured vaguely at the entirety of the situation. Given I'm a county road worker, living in the mountains, who broke your car window and carried you through a blizzard. I was going to say given that we just met, but yours works too. The fire settled, throwing an orange shift of light across the room. Grant could hear, faintly, the sound of Ellie's bedside lamp clicking off. She always clicked it twice before she settled, a habit he'd never asked her to explain. He got up and put another log on the fire. The north wall made its sound. He listened to it carefully, the way he'd learned to listen to everything, not with alarm, but with attention. Measuring, cataloging. For now it was what it was. Cabin working against the weight of the storm. Holding. He stood at the fire a moment longer than he needed to. Behind him, Camille sat at the table with her coffee and her thoughts. And the strange compressed world of 2 days in a mountain storm had already started doing the things storms did when you couldn't escape them, stripping away the performance of who you were supposed to be, leaving something smaller and more actual in its place. Neither of them would have been able to name it yet. But it was there. The second night was quieter than the first, in the way that meant both of them slept, which was its own kind of progress, and Grant was up again before 5. Listening to the cabin in the dark, going through the same rotation of checks that his body performed automatically whether he wanted it to or not. He stood at the north wall and pressed his palm flat against the interior paneling. The groan was lower now, slower, but more consistent. He stood there for a long time in the dark, hand flat on the wall, listening to the weight of the mountain winter pressing down on the cabin's oldest and most vulnerable side. He thought about the conversation he'd had years ago with the contractor who'd looked at those supports and said, "You've got time, but not forever." Grant had thought he understood what that meant. Standing in the dark with his hand on a shuddering wall and a 7-year-old girl and a woman he'd known for 36 hours, both sleeping under his roof, he understood it somewhat better now. He didn't sleep after that. He went back to the couch and lay there with his eyes open, listening to the storm and the wall and the specific vocabulary of a structure under load. And somewhere around 6 in the morning, he made a decision he'd been turning over since he first pressed his palm to that paneling in the dark. He got up, dressed quietly, and went to the storage space at the back of the cabin where he kept tools and emergency supplies, and the things he accumulated over 4 years of living in a place where the nearest hardware store was 40 minutes away in good weather. He had 2 come-alongs, a length of heavy chain, 3 ratchet straps, and a stack of 2x10s he'd been saving for the deck repair he kept postponing. He stood looking at these things with his flashlight and did the math a man with SEAL training and construction experience does when he's assessing a structural problem he doesn't have full information on and doesn't have the right tools for and can't call anyone to help with. It wasn't good math. There was no version of it that came out clean. What he could do was buy time, shore up the worst of it from the inside, redistribute some of the load, keep monitoring. Come-alongs attached to the interior ceiling beams could pull against the outward lean he suspected was developing on the north wall. It wouldn't fix anything. It might prevent the situation from accelerating. He worked quietly for 2 hours. The cold in the storage space was significant. No insulation on that exterior wall at all, and by the time he finished his hands were stiff enough that he had to run them under warm water at the kitchen sink for 3 minutes before he could make a proper fist. He made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window watching the sky. The storm had changed overnight. The wind was still there, but the character of it was different, less sustained, gusting in longer intervals. The snow coming down had thinned from the solid white wall of the previous day to something more recognizable as individual flakes. He checked the thermometer mounted outside the kitchen window. 12 degrees. Colder than yesterday, which was not what he wanted to hear, but cold sometimes meant the worst of the system was past. He thought about the north wall. He thought about Thursday. He thought about the 2x10s and the come-alongs, and whether what he'd done was enough or just the thing a person did to feel like they'd done something. Ellie was up at 7:30, which was late for her. She came out in her pajamas with her hair, doing what her hair always did in the morning, a comprehensive disaster that she was completely unbothered by, and she walked directly to the kitchen. Got herself a glass of water, drank half of it, and then looked at her father. "You were moving stuff around," she said, "working on something in the back." "The wall sound?" He looked at her. "You heard that?" "Last night, when I woke up to use the bathroom," she set her glass down. It sounded different than usual. He'd underestimated her again. He kept doing that, not because he thought she was incapable, but because Seven felt young for certain categories of worry, and he tried to keep those categories from her as much as he could. But Ellie was her mother's daughter in the specific way that meant that she noticed things and filed them and came back to them when she was ready. "I did some work this morning to help it along," he said. "We're going to keep an eye on it." She nodded. She was looking at him with that level look she'd learned from him without either of them intending it, the one that said she was deciding how much of what she'd been told was the whole story. "Okay," she said, and went to get her drawing pad. Camille appeared around 8. She'd figured out the bathroom routine by now, used the spare toothbrush he'd pointed out the first night, pulled her hair back with something she'd apparently found in the bathroom cabinet. She was getting her bearings faster than most people would have, adapting to the shape of the cabin and its rhythms in a way that struck Grant as less flexibility than determination. She'd decided to function in this place, so she was functioning. "How's the wall?" she said, pouring coffee. He told her what he'd done. Not more, not less. She listened with her mug at her lips. "And that buys us time? That's what it's designed to do." "How much time?" "I don't know," he said. "Depends on how much the load increases. Storm drops more wet snow on that side tonight. The calculation changes." She was quiet for a moment. "What do we do if it changes?" "I'll know before it becomes critical. If we need to move to the back of the cabin, the rear bedroom is the strongest section. It's on a different beam system, separate from the north roof section." She looked at him. "You've thought about this." "I've been thinking about it since 2 in the morning." She set her mug down. "Tell me what you need me to do." It was the right question, and it was asked the right way, not panicked, not performatively calm, just practical. He thought of a half-dozen people he'd served with who'd have done worse. Right now, nothing. Stay aware of where Ellie is. If I say move, we move without discussion. Understood. He expected something else, a follow-up question, a request for more certainty. She just picked her mug back up and nodded once, and that was the end of it. The middle part of that day was the strange, suspended kind of time that happened when you were waiting on something you couldn't accelerate. Grant moved between the front room and the storage space, checking his rigging every hour and a half, listening to the wall, pressing his palm to the paneling and feeling for vibration. Ellie drew. Camille read, and this time she actually seemed to be reading. He could see her eyes moving at the pace of someone taking something in, rather than going over the same line repeatedly. Around noon, Ellie looked up from her drawing pad and said, "Camille, what did your company make first, before all the other things?" Camille lowered the book. "A scheduling program," she said, "for small businesses, so they could track their employees' hours and shifts without doing it all by hand." "Sounds boring," Ellie said with complete frankness. "It was useful," Camille said. "My brother helped me build it. He was better at the programming side than I was." She paused. "I was better at explaining why anyone should want it." "What did it look like?" "The program? Nothing special. Very plain. Black text on a gray background." A pause. "Marcus kept wanting to add color to it, and I kept telling him the color wasn't the point. The function was the point. And he kept saying the two weren't mutually exclusive." She looked at the fire. "He was right about that." Ellie considered this. "My teacher says that too. That things can be both useful and beautiful. Smart teacher." "She's okay," Ellie allowed. "She gives too much math homework." Camille smiled. "Your brother sounds like he was kind," Ellie said. Beat. Grant looked up from the table where he was doing a hand-drawn layout of the roof structure from memory, trying to identify the precise span where the load was likely concentrating. "He was," Camille said. "He was also late to everything, and he ate the last of things without replacing them, and he had this laugh that was way too loud for any indoor space." Her voice had the specific texture of someone describing a person they can see completely clearly because they've spent years trying to hold on to the image. "But yeah, mostly kind." Ellie nodded seriously. "My mom was like that," she said. "My dad tells me things about her so I don't forget." The room was quiet. "That's a good dad," Camille said. Ellie looked at Grant. "He is," she said, "even when he's annoying." Grant went back to his diagram. Afternoon light was going by 3:30. The mountain winter pulling dark down early the way it did, and Grant was on his third check of the rigging in the storage space when he heard the sound change. Stopped moving. It wasn't louder. Exactly. It was different. The low groan he'd been monitoring had shifted register deeper, with a periodicity to it that was new, a rhythm that corresponded to the load settling rather than holding. He stood in the dark of the storage space for 30 seconds listening to it, and his body made the assessment before his brain finished articulating it. This had moved out of the category of watching into the category of acting. He came out of the storage space fast, not running, but the kind of controlled urgency that meant business. He went directly to the living room doorway. Ellie was on the floor with her drawing pad. Camille was on the couch with her book. Both of them looked up when he appeared. "We're moving to the back bedroom," he said. "Now. Don't bring anything you have to think about." Camille was on her feet before he finished the sentence. She looked at Ellie. Ellie was already moving, reaching for her drawing pad. "Leave it," Grant said. But Ellie, she left it. He went to the kitchen, pulled the emergency kit from the cabinet above the refrigerator flashlights. Batteries, first aid, the small camp lantern he kept charged, and grabbed the 2 wool blankets from the couch. He was reaching for the third one on the chair when he heard something that had no ambiguity in it at all. Crack. Not a settling sound, not the cabin's normal vocabulary. A fracture sound, something giving way under load, the specific sharp report of wood fiber separating. And then another one, deeper, followed by a sound like the mountain itself clearing its throat. Grant moved. He was in the hallway in 2 strides, and he nearly collided with Camille, who had not gone to the bedroom as he'd directed, but had come back down the hall toward him, and in her arms was Ellie. Fully lifted, the 7-year-old pressed against her chest, Camille's arms locked under her, the child's face tucked against her shoulder. She had gone back for Ellie before he could. He registered this in the half-second it took to redirect around them. "Go," he said. "End of the hall, last door." Camille turned and went. Ellie's face appeared over her shoulder, wide-eyed and white, and she looked at Grant with the look of a child who is trusting completely in an adult's ability to make things right and has nothing to fall back on if that trust is misplaced. He held her eyes for exactly 1 second. "I'm right behind you," he said. He went back to the living room for the blankets and the lantern. The north wall came in while he was standing in it. Not all of it. Not the way a complete structural failure happened. It was more specific than that, a section of roof approximately 12 feet wide over the northern quarter of the living room, let go at the ridge beam, and when it went, it took part of the ceiling and a section of the exterior wall below it. Snow poured in immediately, not a trickle but a volume, the accumulated weight of 2.5 days of blizzard finding its exit point all at once. 2 ceiling timbers came down, one of them hitting the couch where Camille had been sitting 20 minutes ago and driving it 1.5 feet across the floor. The other hit the kitchen table. Grant's diagram went somewhere in the white and the dark. Temperature in the room dropped about 15 degrees in 4 seconds. The wind came through the hole in the wall like it had been waiting specifically for this, and Grant got a face full of snow and ice crystals that hit with enough force to make his eyes water. He had the blankets. He had the lantern. He went down the hallway. The living room was already becoming uninhabitable behind him. The rear bedroom was 10 by 12 feet, which was not a large space for 3 people, but it was intact, and it was separated from the collapsed section by 2 closed doors and a hallway. And it was warm, not as warm as the living room had been with the fire going. But the cabin's heating system ran to a small baseboard unit in the bedroom that was still drawing power from the generator, and the room had better insulation than any other part of the structure, because Grant had redone it 2 years ago. Camille had Ellie on the bed when he came in. She was doing the right thing, talking to her quietly, not performing calm exactly, but creating it, giving Ellie something steady to anchor to while the sound of the collapse worked through the walls. Grant closed the door and sat on the floor against it. He took stock. 3 people, 2 heavy wool blankets plus the bedding. Camp lantern, which he clicked on now, filling the room with a warm amber light that made everything look slightly more manageable than it was. First aid kit. Flashlights. The baseboard heater drawing on the generator, which was housed in its own outbuilding and was not affected by the roof collapse. Temperature would drop in the bedroom as the rest of the cabin's warmth bled away through the breach, but it would stabilize. He did the math. The generator had fuel for another 20 hours. The baseboard unit would keep the room above freezing. They were not going to freeze to death in this bedroom. He said all of this out loud, clearly and in order, not because Camille or Ellie needed to be talked through it like children, but because information in a frightening situation was a form of control, and he was offering them the only kind of control available right now. When he finished, Ellie said, "Is the cabin broken?" "Part of it," he said. "Yes." She thought about this. "Your come-alongs didn't work?" They slowed it down. "We had time to get back here because of them." She considered this seriously. "Okay," she said. Camille was looking at him over Ellie's head. He could see the question in her face, the one about what came next, about whether he had a plan for morning, about the radio and the truck and the road, and he held up one finger, just slightly, meaning one thing at a time. She understood. "I'm cold," Ellie said. "We're going to do something about that," Camille said. She looked at Grant. He got up and brought both blankets to the bed, layering them over the existing bedding. Ellie was in the middle of the mattress. The obvious solution to the temperature problem was the obvious one, and after a moment that contained no discussion, because none was needed, Grant sat on one side of the bed and Camille sat on the other, and Ellie was between them with the blankets pulled up to her chin. "Is the truck okay?" Ellie asked. "Truck's in the driveway," Grant said. "Truck's fine. Is Mrs. Paulson's cat okay?" "The cat is definitely fine." Okay, she was quiet for a moment. "Camille." "Yeah," Camille said. "You picked me up." "I did. You didn't have to do that. You could have just run a pause." "I know," Camille said. Ellie thought about this with the thoroughness she applied to things that mattered to her. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome." The lantern threw its amber light across the ceiling. The wind outside was working at the breach in the living room, which meant they could hear it clearly, a hollow, Continuous sound, like being inside something very large that was breathing. But the bedroom held its own. The walls were solid, and the door was closed, and the baseboard clicked on at intervals. Grant listened to the structure around them. The collapse had happened, and the risk of secondary failure was real for the next hour or two, the unsettled load redistributing, finding new points of stress. He tracked every sound carefully, building a mental map of what was staying and what was shifting. An hour in, the sounds settled into something more static, and he allowed himself to relax by about 20%. Ellie fell asleep. Not quickly, she fought it for a while. The way she did when things were too interesting or too unsettled, but eventually the warmth and the rhythm of the lantern light got to her, and her breathing slowed, and her body went slack the way bodies did in sleep, all the tension of being awake, suddenly absent. She curled toward Camille, not toward Grant, toward Camille. He watched it happen without trying to interpret it. It was a sleeping child moving toward warmth. It was the animal logic of the body. He knew that. He watched Camille's face when it happened, the slight change there, the thing that moved through his expression and then settled into something quieter. She looked down at Ellie for a moment, and then she lifted her arm, carefully, not waking her, and put it around the small curved back. They sat in the amber light with the sleeping child between them and the storm, working at the walls, and Grant was acutely aware of the specific strangeness of this moment a week ago, a month ago. He could not have described how a situation like this would even happen to someone like him. The life he'd built was deliberately narrow. He'd made it that way. Narrow was safe. Narrow was survivable. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," Camille said. "Same quiet. You? I've had better weeks." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "Me too." They stayed like that a while without talking. The lantern was a steady orange warmth. Outside, the storm was doing what it was going to do, regardless of any of them. "When you were in the Navy," Camille said, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Ellie, "did you have situations where everything went wrong, but you came out okay?" "Yes." "What made the difference between the ones that came out okay and the ones that didn't?" He thought about it. The actual answer was complicated. It involved luck and variables that had nothing to do with skill or will, and he knew that better than most people, but there was a real answer inside the complicated one. "Staying in the current moment," he said, "not the moment you expected to be in. The one you're actually in." She looked at him. "What does that mean practically?" "It means if the plan fails, you don't grieve the plan. You work with what's in front of you." He looked at the bedroom wall. "The plan tonight was to get through to Thursday and get the road open and get you back to Denver. That plan is gone. What we actually have is this room and the generator and enough sense between us to get through the night. So that's what we work with." Camille was quiet for a moment. "I'm not good at that," she said, letting go of the plan. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You've known me for 2 days. "Less," he said. "But it's been a busy 2 days." She looked at Ellie, at the dark hair spread on the pillow, the small sleeping face utterly unguarded in the way only sleeping children's faces were. "She looks like you," Camille said, around the eyes. That serious look. "She looks like Catherine around the mouth," Grant said. "And she has Catherine's hands. She's going to be taller than both of us eventually." He paused. "Catherine was 5'9". "You talk about her like you've been talking about her for a long time, and also like it's still new," Camille said. He thought about whether that was accurate. "Both," he said. "It's always both." She nodded. "Marcus is both," she said. "Some days I think about something and want to call him, and then I remember, and that particular thing doesn't get old." She exhaled slowly. "I read somewhere that grief was just love with nowhere to go. I thought that was sentimental when I read it. I don't think so anymore." "No," Grant said, "it's not sentimental." The lantern dimmed slightly, a flicker in the power draw, and then came back. Both of them looked at it and then at each other. "Generator's fine," he said. "Just the load shifting." She nodded. Ellie made a small sound in her sleep, something that wasn't a word, and pressed closer to Camille without waking. Camille tightened her arms slightly, automatically, the way people did when they were holding something they didn't want to disturb. Grant watched his daughter sleeping in the arms of someone he hadn't known existed 3 days ago, and the feeling it produced in him was one he couldn't have named with any precision. Not comfort, exactly. Not alarm. Something that sat between the two, recognition, maybe, of a kind he hadn't expected. He woke before dawn because his body insisted on it, and he lay for a moment on his side of the bed in the amber going to gray light of the lantern running low and took stock. The structure around them had been quiet for hours. The baseboard had cycled off and on through the night. He was warmer than he'd expected to be, which was the math of 3 people and several blankets working in a small space the way it was supposed to. Ellie was still between them, completely horizontal now, in the way children migrated in their sleep, her feet somewhere near Camille's knees and her head near Grant's arm. Camille was awake. He could tell by her breathing. "How long have you been up?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "Hour, maybe." "I did some." A pause. "I'm not a great sleeper under normal circumstances." "What do you do when you can't sleep at home?" "Work," she said. "Check my email. Look at projections." "And that helps?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "but it's something to do." He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Ellie. The lantern was almost out down to a faint orange glow that gave him just enough to see the room. He got up, found his flashlight, clicked it on. "I'm going to assess the living room," he said. "I'll be back." He opened the bedroom door and moved down the hall. Cold hit him immediately, intense, dry, the temperature of the living room having equalized somewhere close to door temperature through the breach in the north wall. He clicked his flashlight around. The scope of it was clear in the flashlight beam. 12-foot section of the north wall and the corresponding roof section had come in, and then settled. The debris wasn't scattered so much as stacked. Timbers, crossing each other in an irregular structure, held together by the packed snow that had come in with them. The living room couch was destroyed. The kitchen table had survived, but one leg was cracked. The wood stove was intact. The chimney ran through a different section of the roof and was fine. The rest of the cabin, south and east, was structurally unaffected. He did a full circuit of the exterior walls, checking each section systematically. Nothing else was compromised. The collapse had been concentrated exactly where he'd expected it. He went back to the bedroom. "Manageable," he said. "The living room is gone, but the rest of the cabin is solid. We can use the kitchen. The wood stove is intact. I can get a fire going once I clear the access." Camille was sitting up. "When does the storm break?" "Look at the window." She looked. The quality of light coming through the frost on the glass was different, not the dead gray of the previous 2 days, but something with actual direction to it, the suggestion of a source. "Storm broke overnight," he said. "We have cold and we have snow on the ground, but the worst is past." He looked at his watch. "By this afternoon the road will be passable. I can get us out." She looked at the window for a long moment. "The drawing pad," she said. He looked at her. "Ellie's drawing pad. She left it in the living room when we moved." He thought about the scope of the debris in the living room, and whether he could get to the area near the floor where Ellie had been sitting. "I'll look," he said. He went back to the living room with his flashlight. The snow had partially hardened over the debris pile, but the path to the far side of the room, near the east wall where Ellie always sat to draw, was navigable along the wall. He got there, crouched, swept the beam. The drawing pad was on the floor against the baseboard, partially under a fine layer of snow dust, but intact. The collapse had happened on the north side of the room, and the pad had been on the east. Picked it up and brushed it off and brought it back. When he handed it to Camille, she looked at it for a moment before taking it. Something in her expression he couldn't read cleanly. "Thank you," she said. "It's her work," he said. "She'll want it." Ellie slept for another hour. When she woke, the first thing she did was reach for the drawing pad that Camille's had set on the nightstand beside her, and the relief that crossed her face when she found it. There was the particular relief of a person reunited with the specific thing they would have genuinely grieved. She sat up and opened it and began paging through the previous drawings, checking them: mountains, trees. The cabin's exterior, Grant in his work coat with a shovel misses. Paulson's cat rendered with impressive anatomical accuracy for someone who had seen it exactly twice. She stopped on a blank page near the back and looked at it for a moment. Then she took a pencil from the case she'd brought with her in her pajama pocket, because Ellie never went anywhere without a pencil, which was a habit he'd given up trying to understand and simply accepted, and she began to draw. He watched her work. She drew quickly when she knew what she wanted, the pencil moving with a sureness that still struck him as remarkable in someone who was 7 1/2. He could see the cabin emerging on the page, the basic shape of it. The roof line, the chimney, the tree line behind it. She drew it the way it had looked before the collapse. Then she drew 3 figures in front of it. Small, quick, the kind of shorthand children used when they were getting at the idea of a person rather than the detail. 2 taller ones and 1 small one. She drew them in a line, close together, the small one between the 2 larger figures, which was roughly the spatial relationship of last night on the bed, though Ellie had been asleep and hadn't been consciously recording it. She held it up. "Look," she said. Camille took the drawing pad and looked at it. Her face was still for a moment in a way that was different from her other kinds of stillness, not the controlled stillness of a CEO on a call, or the careful stillness of someone being guarded, but the kind that happened when something reached something that normally stayed protected. She handed the pad back to Ellie. "That's us," she said. "Yes," Ellie said, and turned to a fresh page and kept drawing. Camille looked at Grant. He looked back at her. There was nothing to say to what had just happened. The drawing existed. Ellie had made a fact of something that had still been theoretical a day ago, and she'd done it without asking anyone's permission, with the simple certainty of a child, who drew what she saw and saw what was actually there. Grant sat on the edge of the bed and watched his daughter draw in the amber morning light. Outside, for the first time in 3 days, the wind was quiet. The mountain stood where it always had, indifferent and vast, and the sky above Hollow Ridge was turning from gray to something with color in it. The first pale suggestion of blue working in along the eastern ridge, like a door being opened, slowly from the other side. The blue along the eastern ridge didn't last. By 8 in the morning, it had been replaced by a high, flat gray that was at least not moving, which was the main thing. Grant got a fire going in the wood stove by clearing a path through the debris on the south side of the living room. It took 40 minutes and required moving 2 sections of fallen ceiling timber by hand, which his backlogged a formal complaint about, and got the kitchen to a temperature where it was usable. The bedroom was still the warmest space, so that's where Ellie stayed while he worked, drawing in the amber light of the fresh lantern batteries and occasionally calling out questions to wherever he was in the cabin. "Can we eat breakfast?" "Working on it." "Is the oatmeal okay?" "Where the oatmeal is." "Pantry's fine." "Give me 20 minutes. The oatmeal is in the 3rd cabinet." "I know where the oatmeal is, Ellie." Camille appeared in the kitchen doorway at some point during this, already wearing her coat, and without asking what needed doing, she went to the storage lean-to and began moving snow away from the back door that had drifted against it overnight. She worked steadily and without comment for half an hour, while Grant cleared the wood stove access and got the fire running and assessed the kitchen ceiling intact, no issues, and got water boiling. They ate oatmeal at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, the cracked table leg shimmed with a folded piece of cardboard that kept it from wobbling. The living room was sealed off by a sheet of heavy plastic Grant had tacked over the hallway entrance to keep the cold from bleeding through. You could hear the wind occasionally moving through the debris on the other side of it, a low, irregular sound, and every time it happened, Ellie looked at the plastic sheeting and then went back to her oatmeal without comment. "We need to move today," Grant said. "Once I clear enough of the driveway to get the truck out, I'm going to get us to higher ground where the radio has a better line. There's a ridge about 2 miles up the fire road that gets reliable county dispatch. From there we can coordinate." "Coordinate what?" Ellie asked. "Getting Camille back to Denver, getting us somewhere while the cabin is being fixed." "Where will we go?" "Mrs. Paulson's probably for a few days." Ellie accepted this. "Mrs. Paulson has too many decorative plates," she said, "but her guest bed is comfortable. I'll let her know you said so." "Don't do that." Camille was looking at her oatmeal. "You don't have to coordinate my transport," she said. "If I can get a signal, I can have someone come up." "In what?" Grant said. "The road's not open. County crews will run it first. Then it'll take another 12 hours before anything without a plow has a reasonable shot at it." He shook his head. "I've got the truck, and I know this mountain. We go together to the ridge, we make the calls, we figure out the next step from there." She looked like she was going to push back, and then she didn't. "Okay," she said. "Your company will be fine," he said. Not to be kind, because he believed it was probably true. "You've been out of contact for 2.5 days. If it were going to fall apart in 2.5 days, it would have fallen apart before you got to where you are." She looked at him for a moment. That's not actually how companies work. Maybe. But you're still here, and it's still there. That's a reasonable data point. She looked at her coffee. Something in her face shifted in a way he was starting to recognize the micro-adjustment that happened when she was considering something she'd already decided and looking for a way to let go of the tension around it. My VP of Operations, she said. Dana. She's run every department I've ever had. If anyone can hold it together without me, she can. There you go, Grant said. I just have trouble letting her. Yeah, he said. I noticed that about you. She looked at him with an expression that straddled the line between irritated and self-aware. Ellie watched this exchange with the focused attention of someone filing information for later use. Getting the truck out took the better part of 3 hours. The driveway had 4-foot drifts in 2 places, and the area around the truck itself had packed snow past the running boards on the driver's side. Grant used the plow blade in reverse to push his way clear, working in sections, and Camille handled the shovel when he needed the drifts broken up in spots where the blade couldn't reach. Ellie stayed in the cab, which was warming up, and tracked their progress through the windshield with the focused attention of a small project manager. By 11, they were moving. The fire road to the ridge was a different challenge, narrow, unplowed. The tree canopy, having kept some of the worst accumulation off the road surface, but not all of it. Grant took it in 4-wheel low, feeling the tires find and lose purchase on the ice underneath, correcting without drama each time. Camille sat in the passenger seat with one hand braced on the door panel and said nothing. Ellie, between them again, watched the trees go past. This is where you put the tire chains on, Ellie said, at a point about halfway up where the grade steepened.
I know,
Grant said. You always say you're going to put them on at the bottom, and then you don't. I know that too. Why don't you? Because I always think I won't need them, and then I do. He felt the rear end shift slightly and corrected. It's a flaw. I'll remind you next time, she said.
Please do.
Camille had her eyes on the road ahead. How far is the ridge? Half a mile. He could see it through the trees, the break in the canopy, where the fire road opened onto the exposed shelf of rock and snow that gave the best line of sight in this part of the mountain. 2 minutes. They came out onto the ridge at 11:22. The view was what it always was up there, the kind of thing that stopped conversation without trying. The entire Hollow Ridge Valley laid out below, with the town a scatter of buildings and smoke, and the mountain ranges stacked behind it in successive gray-blue layers going all the way to the horizon. Sky directly overhead had opened into a thin, wintry blue. Below, the storm's aftermath lay across the landscape like something that had tried very hard and finally exhausted itself. Grant killed the engine and picked up the radio. Dispatch came back clear on the first try. He gave them his location and situation. The collapsed roof section, the woman stranded from the Denver area, the need for road status on the county route. Dispatcher, he recognized her voice. A woman named Bev, who'd been on county dispatch for 15 years and who had a particular tone when she thought you'd done something preventable, confirmed that Route 9 was being run by the plow crews and would be passable by late afternoon. She also confirmed she had a relay message from 2 days ago, several calls from a Denver number looking for Camille Arden, including one from someone named Dana Kowalski. Grant handed the radio to Camille. She looked at it. It wasn't a cell phone, and it wasn't her system, and she'd clearly never used a county radio before. He showed her the transmit button and the protocol, and then she held it like she was holding something that mattered and keyed it. This is Camille Arden. Can you relay a message to a Denver number for me? Bev, to her credit, said yes without commentary and took the number and the message. I'm safe. In Hollow Ridge. Road opens this afternoon. We'll call when I have signal. Tell Dana to hold the Meridian meeting until I'm back. She handed the radio back. Her hands were steady. Whatever she'd been carrying for the past 2.5 days, the weight of the unreachable, the particular anxiety of someone who ran things being unable to run anything, he could see some portion of it leave her when she set the radio down. The Meridian meeting, he said. Big client. 7 figures if it goes right. She looked at the valley below. It'll probably be fine. Dana's better in rooms than I am when she's not managing around me. Managing around you, he repeated. I have a tendency to take over. She said it without apparent self-pity. Just a fact she'd arrived at. Marcus used to call me a benevolent steamroller. He meant it as a compliment, mostly. It's a mixed compliment. That's what I told him. She looked at the ridgeline, at the improbable winter beauty of the valley, the kind of place that made you understand why people chose difficult lives in hard terrain. He said most of the best compliments were. Ellie had gotten out of the truck while they were talking and was standing at the edge of the ridge shelf, looking down at Hollow Ridge, with her hands in her coat pockets, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She looked very small against the scale of what was behind her and completely unbothered by this fact. Grant watched her. She's not afraid of much, is she? Camille said. Of some things, he said, the dentist. The sound the smoke alarm makes. He paused. She was afraid in the bedroom last night. She didn't show it, but I know what it looks like on her. She trusted you to handle it. Yeah, he was quiet for a moment. That's the hardest part of raising a kid alone, I think. Not the logistics, the weight of being the thing they trust completely. There's no one to share it with. Camille didn't say anything. He hadn't meant it as a complaint, exactly. It was just something that was true, and that he didn't usually say out loud, because there was no point saying it to anyone who wasn't in the situation. I imagine Catherine did that for you, Camille said. Shared the weight. She was better at it than I was, honestly. I'm better at the logistics. He looked at Ellie at the ridge edge. Catherine was better at the emotional side, knowing when Ellie needed talking to versus giving space. I get that wrong sometimes. What does getting it wrong look like? He thought about it. Giving her information when she needs comfort. Giving her comfort when she wants information. He shrugged. I'm learning. She seems like she's learning you too, Camille said. Compensating where you don't. That's not a small thing in a 7-year-old. He looked at her. I'm not saying she's parenting you, Camille said. I'm saying she knows you. That's what it looks like when someone knows you. He looked back at Ellie. Yeah, he said, you're right about that. They came down off the ridge at noon and drove to Mrs. Paulson's, which was the agreed plan and the sensible one. Mrs. Paulson was 81 years old and approximately 5 feet tall, and she met them at the door with the specific energy of someone who had been monitoring the situation and had opinions about all of it. She looked at Grant, looked at Ellie, looked at Camille, and said, well, come in then, in a tone that covered everything. Her house was warm and overfurnished, and smelled like the soup she kept on the stove in winter on general principle. The decorative plates were present in the numbers Ellie had described. She fed them lunch without asking whether they wanted it, set Ellie up in the second bedroom with her drawing pad and a blanket and the cat, whose name was Ferdinand, and who had an extremely specific set of preferences about where it would allow itself to be touched. Grant and Mrs. Paulson talked in the kitchen, while Camille used the landline in the hallway, which Mrs. Paulson still had because she'd decided cellular phones were designed by people who didn't understand that some calls needed to be made sitting down with a cord in your hand. The north wall, Mrs. Paulson said in the same tone she used when Grant had made a decision she'd been waiting to comment on.
I know.
You've known about that wall for 2 years. I know that too. She looked at him over her reading glasses, with the expression of a woman who had survived 81 years by saying what she thought and wasn't about to stop. Staying? Her car's on Route 9 and the road opens this afternoon. She'll be back in Denver tonight or tomorrow. That's not what I asked. Grant picked up the coffee mug she'd set in front of him and didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer and which Mrs. Paulson received without comment. From the hallway, they could hear Camille's voice, low and professional, a different register than anything he'd heard from her. In the cabin, the competent, directed voice of someone who ran things and was returning to running them. Caught fragments, I understand. Push it to Wednesday. No, tell them I'll be there in person. What did legal say about the Marchetti Amendment? A pause. That's wrong. The clause was modified in the October draft. Get Davis on the phone. The sound of someone for whom the past 3 days had been a suspension of their actual life, not a replacement of it. Which was accurate. He knew that. She had a company and a city and a life built across years, and the mountain and the cabin and the 3 days inside the storm were an interruption in that life, not a replacement of it. He understood this clearly. He was still sitting with what it felt like, which was not entirely comfortable. Camille came back to the kitchen 20 minutes later. She looked like herself in a different way than she had in the cabin, more buttoned up, more composed, the CEO expression back in place. But not entirely. There were seams showing that hadn't been there before, or maybe had been there, and he could see them now. Dana held everything, she said. The Meridian meeting is Wednesday. She handled the Parsons situation herself, which she's been capable of doing for 2 years, and I've never let her. She sat down. She sounded relieved to have done it. There's information in that, Grant said. I know. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug, Mrs. Paulson had sat in front of her. There's a lot of information in the last 3 days. Mrs. Paulson, who had the social grace of someone who knew when to disappear, went to check on Ellie and Ferdinand. Kitchen was quiet. Can I ask you something? Camille said. Sure. When you left the Seals, was it because you wanted to or because it was time? He looked at his coffee. Catherine was pregnant, he said. And I'd done 9 years, and I'd seen enough of what that job did to families. I wasn't naive about it going in, I knew what it cost. But when it's abstract, it costs you differently than when it's specific. He paused. When it was Ellie specific, it was an easy call. But you missed it. Parts of it. The clarity of it. He turned the mug in his hands. In the field, the objective is stated. The variables are hard, but they're defined. There's a right answer even when it's brutal. He looked at the window over Mrs. Paulson's sink, the bare winter yard beyond it. Civilian life has a lot more ambiguity. That's a polite way of putting it. I have a 7-year-old. I've had to get better at polite. She almost smiled. Do you still think about going back? Can't, he said. Medically, my back. He said it flat, without the self-pity he might have felt about it in a different year. And even if I could know, Ellie needs consistent. He said the word like it meant something specific to him. I spent enough years being the opposite of that. You seem consistent to me. I'm more consistent than I was. It's not the same thing. She was looking at him in the way she sometimes did in the cabin, the direct, appraising look of someone accustomed to reading people and taking what they read seriously. What are you going to do about the cabin? She asked. Fix it. She stopped. Money for it. He said it without embarrassment because it was a real question and they were past the point of managing each other's comfort. Some. Not enough for what it needs. I'll get quotes in the spring, figure out what I can handle myself, find the financing for the rest. He shrugged. Been standing for 40 years. It'll stand again. She nodded slowly. She looked like she was going to say something and then chose not to, and he noticed the choice. Route 9 opened at 4:15 that afternoon. The county plow came through first, then a second truck doing sand and salt, and by the time Grant drove Camille back up to the crash site, her SUV was visible again. The plow crew had pushed snow clear of it as part of the road work, and it sat on the shoulder looking battered but intact. The broken rear window he'd put his elbow through, covered now by a frozen curtain of ice on the interior. They stood beside it in the late afternoon light. The temperature was in the single digits, and the cold was the clear, purposeful cold of a Colorado winter post-storm, the kind that had an opinion about exposed skin. SUV started on the second try, which surprised him, and after 10 minutes of running settled into something that sounded reliable enough. The heat came on. The dash showed a quarter tank of gas, which would get her to the Hollow Ridge town limits where there was a station. Ellie had gotten out of the truck and was standing beside her father with her hands in her pockets. She looked at Camille. Camille looked at her. Will you come back? Ellie said. Grant started to say something about that being up to Camille, about Denver being far and people being busy, about how Camille spoke before he could. Yes, she said. Ellie nodded. She accepted this the same way she accepted. Most things Grant told her were true as settled. She went back to the truck and got in and started looking for something in her backpack. Camille looked at Grant. I meant it, she said. I know, he said. I could tell. She looked at the mountain behind him, at the ridge where they'd sat with the radio that morning, and looked out over the valley. I'm not, she stopped. Try it again. I don't know what this is. Neither do I, he said. But I know I meant what I said to Ellie. He looked at her. At the CCO, with the cracked business card in his coat pocket, who he'd pulled out of a buried car in a blizzard, and who had lifted his daughter and run down a hallway while the roof came in, and who had stayed awake in the dark keeping watch when she could have been sleeping, and who had sat at his kitchen table and talked about Marcus with the plainness of someone done pretending that loss was manageable. Okay, he said. Okay, she said back. It was not a complete exchange. It was a placeholder for a longer conversation that neither of them had the vocabulary for yet, standing in single-digit cold on the shoulder of Route 9, which was not the location for that conversation anyway. She got in the SUV. He stood by the driver's window. "The road to the highway is clear," he said. "Gas station at Hollow Ridge, Maine. You've got enough to get there. I know. Call when you're in Denver." "I don't have your number." He took out his phone and then remembered the signal situation. He looked at it. She took a business card from her coat pocket, a different one from the one that had been in there when he found her. She must have had a second one and wrote a number on the back and handed it through the window. "My personal cell," she said. "Not the office line." He took it. "Read it." Looked at her. "Drive carefully," he said. "The road's clear, but watch the shaded sections. Grant."
Yeah.
She looked at him in the last of the afternoon light, the mountain going purple behind him, the cold making everything sharp and specific. "Thank you for stopping," she said. "I know you almost didn't." He thought about telling her he hadn't almost not stopped, that of course he'd have stopped, that any person would have stopped. But that wasn't true, and she would have known. It wasn't true, and it was the wrong time to say something that wasn't true. "Yeah," he said, "but I did." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she put the SUV in drive. He stood on the shoulder of Route 9 and watched the taillights move down the mountain until the road curved and they were gone. The first call came 11 days later. Grant was at the county yard going over the maintenance schedule for the spring plows when his phone buzzed with a Denver number he'd put in his contacts under the name he had for her Camille Arden. The same as the business card, which was formal enough to be funny, and also the only name he had. He stepped outside into the March cold to take it. "Hey," she said. "Hey," a pause that was not uncomfortable. "How's the cabin? Got a contractor out last week. The numbers are..." He looked at the mountains above the county yard. "Not great, but manageable." "What does manageable mean?" "It means I can handle it if I don't buy anything else for about 2 years. "Grant, I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I know what you were about to say." "You don't know what I was about to say. I have a pretty good idea." Pause. "Maybe," she said, "but I wasn't going to say it the way you think." He leaned against the wall of the county building and looked at the sky. "How's the company?" "Different," she said. "I gave Dana the Meridian account. Permanently. She closed it last week for 12% over what I'd have accepted." A pause. "I've been leaving the office before 7. I didn't realize how much light there still was at 7. "It's a thing," he said. "I've been eating dinner at an actual table. Not my desk. Also a thing." He could hear her breathing, and behind that, the faint ambient sound of a city traffic. Distance. The particular texture of a place that was nothing like a mountain road in a blizzard. "Ellie wrote me a letter," Camille said. "You know about this?" "She didn't tell me she was doing it," he said. "She asked me for the right address. She told me 3 facts about mustelids I didn't know." And she drew a picture of Ferdinand, Mrs. Paulson's cat. "The anatomical accuracy is impressive. I know, it's slightly unnerving." He pushed off the wall. "She'll be glad you got it. Tell her I'm going to write back." "Tell her yourself," he said. "I'm putting her on when I get home." Pause. Something in it that had a different quality than the pauses in Mrs. Paulson's kitchen or on the ridge looser, maybe. Less careful. "Okay," Camille said. He came home that evening to Ellie at the kitchen table with her drawing pad and got 2 pieces of information in rapid succession when he walked in, that Ferdinand had bitten Mrs. Paulson's nephew at a recent family dinner, which Ellie relayed with the specific satisfaction of someone who had always found the nephew questionable, and that a box had arrived that afternoon. The box was from Denver. It was addressed to Ellie Mercer in handwriting that was angular and precise. Ellie opened it at the kitchen table with the focus of a surgeon. Inside was a book, a field guide to North American mammals. The professional edition, the kind with detailed anatomical drawings and range maps, the kind that cost actual money, and a note on heavy cardstock that said simply, "For the mustelid expert." More facts enclosed. And below that, a list of 6 mustelid facts written in the same angular handwriting, each one annotated with a source. Ellie read through the list twice. Then she held the book with both hands and looked at it the way she looked at things that mattered to her. She remembered, Ellie said. "Yeah," Grant said. She did. He made dinner, and listened to Ellie talk about mustelids and about what she was going to write back and about whether fishers were technically bigger than wolverines on average, which was the subject of some dispute between her book collection and the internet. And the kitchen was loud with the specific quality of loudness that a 7-year-old generated and that he'd learned to love the particular shape of. He thought about the box sitting on the table, the field guide, 6 annotated facts. He thought about a woman in Denver eating dinner at an actual table, watching the light at 7 in the evening. He thought about the decision he'd made on Route 9, in the dark and the snow and the 14-degree cold, with his hand on the door of a truck, and the voice in his head saying it wasn't his problem. Sometimes the math on those decisions didn't show itself until later. Sometimes much later. Sometimes you were standing in your kitchen, listening to your daughter read facts about mustelids from a book a stranger had sent her before they were quite done being a stranger, and you understood something about that night on the mountain that you hadn't fully understood while you were in it. He hadn't known what he was stopping for. He'd stopped anyway. He set the plates on the table and called Ellie to dinner, and the kitchen was warm and loud, and the mountain outside the window was going dark in the way it did in March, slowly, reluctantly, holding the last light longer than it had any business doing. Grant looked at it for a moment before he sat down. Then he sat down, and the evening went forward, the way evenings did, one small moment at a time. The first time Camille came back to Hollow Ridge, she didn't tell him she was coming. It was a Saturday in late March, 6 weeks after the storm, and Grant was on the cabin roof doing the preliminary work the contractor had told him needed doing before the serious reconstruction could begin, clearing the compromised decking on the north section, marking the beam positions, assessing what could be salvaged and what needed to come out entirely. It was cold work, the kind that required constant movement to stay functional, and he'd been up there since 7 in the morning with a pry bar and a chalk line and the contractor's notes in his coat pocket. He heard a car on the access road. He didn't think much of it. The contractor had said he might send someone to take measurements. Grant kept working, listening to the car pull up and the engine cut, and then he heard a door close and footsteps in the snow below, and then Ellie's voice coming from the direction of the woodpile where she'd been stacking. She'd appointed herself in charge of the wood operation that morning, with the seriousness of someone who had been waiting for the right executive role. Ellie said, "You came back." And a voice he knew said, "I told you I would." He put the pry bar down and looked over the edge of the roof. Camille was standing in the snow below, in a coat that was significantly better suited to mountain weather than the one she'd been wearing the night he pulled her out of the SUV. She had boots on that looked like she'd bought them specifically for this. She was looking up at him with the expression he'd come to think of as her working face, direct, slightly guarded, waiting to see how the information she'd delivered would land. He looked at her for a moment. "You could have called," he said. "I know," she said. "I was in the car before I thought about it, and then it seemed pointless to call when I was already most of the way here." "Not a great reason. I know that too." He looked at her another moment. Then he went back to what he was doing. "There's coffee in the kitchen," he called down. "Ellie knows where everything is." He heard Ellie say, "Come on," with an authority that suggested she'd already decided this was her operation to manage. And he listened to them go inside, and he went back to the chalk line on the decking, and something in the set of his shoulders changed, without him deciding that it would. She stayed 2 days. Not in the cabin was not in a state for guests, the living room still sealed off with plastic sheeting, the north wall open to the sky under a temporary tarp the contractor had rigged to keep weather off the interior. She stayed at the Hollow Ridge Inn, which was 3 miles down the county road, and which had 6 rooms and a proprietor named Glenn, who served breakfast that ran about 40 minutes behind when he said it would be ready. Camille took this in stride, which was either adaptability or the influence of spending 3 days in a mountain cabin with no choices whatsoever. On the first evening, she came back to Grant's for dinner and ate the same way she'd eaten in the cabin, like she'd forgotten she was hungry and then remembered all at once, and afterward she and Ellie sat at the kitchen table for an hour going through the Mammal Field Guide, page by page, while Grant did dishes, which he did slowly, because there were worse things than listening to a 7-year-old explain the hunting habits of the wolverine to an audience that was genuinely paying attention. On the second morning, she stood in the snow beside the cabin and looked at the north wall, with her coat zipped to her chin and her hands in her pockets. "Show me what needs to happen," she said. He walked her through it. The damaged section, the beam positions, what the contractor had said about the foundation sill and the ridge support, the new roofline pitch they were going to add to shed snow better. She listened the way she listened to everything, without interrupting, processing, asking one or two specific questions that cut to the parts she actually needed to understand. "The steeper pitch was your idea or the contractor's," she said. "Mine." He agreed with it. "What does it add to the cost?" "About $800 in materials. Saves me having to go up there every heavy snow to clear the load." She nodded. "That's right," he looked at her. "I know," he said. "I'm not second-guessing you. I know that too." She looked at the open sky where the roof had been, the raw ends of the salvaged beams, the tarp moving slightly in the wind. "Want to help pay for it," she said. He'd been expecting something like this. He'd thought about how he'd respond, and he'd arrived at a clear answer. "No," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not going to explain it in a way that makes it sound like pride," he said. "Because it's not exactly that. It's more that the cabin is mine and Ellie's, and what happens to it, and how it gets fixed is ours to carry. That matters to me." She held his eyes. "Okay," she said. "Okay? You said it wasn't pride. I believe you. And I understand what you said." She looked back at the wall. "But I'm going to help with the physical work that you don't get to say no to." He considered this. "You ever swung a hammer?" "Marcus and I built a deck on my parents' house the summer after high school," she said. "I wasn't good at it. I got better." He picked up the pry bar and held it out to her. She took it. She came back again in April. Then twice in May, the second time bringing her laptop because she had a presentation due the following Monday, and she'd learned, somewhat to her own surprise, that she worked better in the kitchen of an almost reconstructed cabin in the mountains than she did in her actual Denver office, which she'd spent considerable money designing for optimal productivity. Grant didn't comment on this. He made coffee. He worked on the cabin. Ellie showed Camille her current drawing project, which had expanded into a multi-page illustrated catalog of Colorado wildlife that was already 43 pages and showed no signs of stopping. The relationship they were building was not a clean thing. It was not without friction. There was a week in May where Camille went 12 days without calling. Not because she didn't want to, but because a financing situation with a new acquisition had turned into a crisis, and she had gone into the mode that Marcus had identified years ago, and that she'd never fully broken the mode where the work became. The walls and the walls went up, and everything outside the walls waited. Grant knew she was in it, because he knew what it looked like from the outside, having done his own version of it for 4 years with a different set of materials. He waited. He didn't chase. When she surfaced and called on a Thursday night, sounding like someone who'd been underwater and had just broken the surface, he said, "How bad was it?" And she told him, and they talked for 2 hours, and at the end she said, "I disappeared again." And he said, "Yeah, you did." And she said, "I'm working on it." And he said, "I know," because he did know, because working on a pattern that kept you alive for years was not a switch you flipped. It was a thing you came back to again and again. And the only meaningful question was whether you kept coming back. There was an argument in June that was real and uncomfortable and did not resolve itself in an evening. Camille had made a suggestion about Ellie's school, a specific private school in Denver she'd researched, one with an arts program that she felt genuinely would serve Ellie's abilities. She'd meant it entirely as information, as an option, as the kind of thing a person offered when they cared about a child's development and had resources to think about that the child's parent might not. Grant heard it as something else. He heard it as the first move in a rearrangement of his life that he hadn't agreed to, and he said so, in a way that was more direct than he intended, and not exactly wrong, but also not exactly fair. Camille got quiet in the particular way she got quiet when she was angry, and had decided not to say everything she was thinking. That quiet lasted about 3 minutes before she said, in a voice that was carefully level, "I wasn't trying to take anything. I was trying to add something. There's a difference, and I'd like you to know I know it." He sat with that. "You're right," he said. "I heard it wrong." "You heard it scared," she said. He looked at her. "That's not a criticism," she said. "I understand why you'd be scared." I'm telling you what I heard. They didn't talk for the rest of that evening with any ease, and she drove back to the Hollow Ridge Inn, and he sat on the back step of the cabin in the dark for a while, which was the thing he did when he needed to run something through without interruption. By morning, he'd arrived at the same place she had, and he called her before 7, and she answered before the second ring, which told him she hadn't slept much either. Cool idea, he said. I want to hear about it. Actually hear about it. A pause. Okay, she said. Give me an hour to get dressed. That was June. In July, Ellie spent a week with Grant's sister in Durango, which was the annual arrangement they had, and Camille came to Hollow Ridge for the same week. Not to stay at the inn. The cabin's north section had been reconstructed by then, sealed in May, the new steep roofline done and solid, the interior still rough in places but habitable. She stayed in Ellie's room. It was the first time they'd been in the cabin alone, without the storm and without Ellie, and it was different in ways that were hard to name with precision. Easier in some ways. Quieter. There was no performance required, no management of someone else's fear or logistics. Just two people in a mountain cabin in July, with the windows open for the first time and the smell of spruce coming in on the warm air. They talked more that week than they had in all the previous months combined. Not about the relationship, not about what they were or what they were doing. That kind of conversation had never been their natural register. They talked about Marcus and Catherine, the actual people, not the sanitized grief-appropriate versions, but the complicated real ones. Camille told him about the time Marcus had borrowed her car without asking, and returned it with an empty tank and a fast food bag on the seat, and a note that said simply, "You're welcome," as if he'd done her a favor. She laughed telling it, a real laugh, the kind that had actual air in it. Grant told her about the time Catherine had decided they were getting a puppy and had already named it before telling him, and how the name she'd chosen was Gerald, which was a name for a puppy he had genuinely struggled with, and how he'd spent 2 years trying to call the dog by a different name while Catherine called it Gerald, and the dog had answered to both with perfect indifference. Camille laughed. Gerald. I tried everything. Jerry. Gee, the dog did not care. What happened to Gerald? He died the year before Catherine, 13 years old. Ellie doesn't really remember him. He paused. Catherine took it pretty hard. She said he stopped, then went on because stopping felt wrong. She said Gerald had been with her through everything that mattered, and now he wasn't, and that was the specific thing she couldn't explain the shape of. Camille was quiet for a moment. I know exactly what she meant, she said. Yeah, he said. I know you do. That week in July was when something shifted between them that had been approaching for a long time, and that both of them had been careful around for reasons that made sense individually and that had started to make less sense as the months went on. It didn't shift dramatically. It shifted the way structural things shifted when enough load had been properly redistributed, not a sudden event, just a new state of rest. On the last evening of that week, they sat on the back step of the cabin and watched the dark come across the ridge, the mountain going through its colors the way it did, purple to gray to the particular dense black of a Colorado mountain night. And Grant thought about the specific night 6 months ago when he'd sat on this same step and run the same argument through his head, and how different the equation was now. Ellie's going to ask when you're moving to Hollow Ridge, he said. Camille looked at him. She hasn't asked yet, she will. He looked at the ridge. I'm not asking you to. I want to be clear about that. I know you're not, she said. I'm also not going to pretend the question isn't there. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about the company structure, she said, in the way she said things that she'd been thinking about for a while and had just decided to say out loud. Dana has been running most of the day-to-day since February. She's better at it than I was. I'm better at the part that happens before the day-to-day, the building, the vision, the structure. I've been operating in the wrong role for about 3 years. What would the right role look like? More remote than not. Denver as needed, not daily. She looked at the ridge. It's taken me a long time to be okay with that, because I always thought leaving the office meant losing control. But I've been watching Dana, and what I'm losing is not control. It's the illusion of control. She paused. Marcus would have told me that years ago. He probably did, Grant said. He definitely did, she said. I wasn't ready to hear it. The mountain was fully dark now. The first stars were out. the particular density of stars you only got above a certain altitude, the kind that people who'd grown up in cities never quite adjusted to. I'm not going to ask you a question tonight, Grant said. She looked at him. I'm going to ask you one in the fall, he said. When the reconstruction is done and you know exactly what this place is before it's also yours. She looked at him for a long time. Okay, she said. Okay, as in you'll still be here in the fall? Okay, as in I'll be here, she said. The reconstruction finished the first week of October. The contractor, a man named Roy, who had the communication style of someone who had decided years ago that most information was conveyed adequately by pointing, came out on a Tuesday morning and did a final walk-around of the north section and said, which Grant had learned over 4 months meant satisfied. The new roof pitch was steep and clean, and the beamwork inside was tight and solid. Roy had let Grant and Camille do certain finish work themselves, the interior paneling on the north wall, the trim around the new window Ellie had negotiated for on the overlooking face, the sealing of the beam joints. This had added 2 weeks to the schedule and reduced the cost accordingly, which was the arrangement Grant had proposed, and which Roy had accepted with a shrug that indicated he didn't care either way. The window was Ellie's, in the way that certain things became a child's by the force of their investment in them. She'd drawn the dimensions she wanted on a piece of paper and handed it to Grant with the confidence of someone filing a specification. Face the ridge east-northeast, overlooking the tree line, the angle that caught the morning light first. Roy had said the framing would add to the cost, and Ellie had looked at Grant with a look that contained an entire argument, and Grant had said fine, and the window existed. It was a good window. He'd been wrong to hesitate. Camille had asked, during the paneling work on the north wall, to be the one to do the section that covered the interior face of the beam that had cracked that night, the one whose failure had started the sequence that sent them down the hallway in the dark. Grant had understood without asking why she wanted to do it. He let her. Inside that beam not visible, behind the paneling, Grant placed 2 pine cones. He'd collected them the morning after the collapse, when he'd done his first assessment of the living room in the daylight and found them on the debris, small and ordinary, the kind the spruce trees dropped constantly. He didn't explain to anyone why he kept them or what he was going to do with them. He just put them in his coat pocket that morning and kept them on the kitchen windowsill for 9 months. And when the paneling went up, he placed them in the space between the old beam and the new support structure. Camille was there when he did it. She didn't ask him to explain. Something you want to hold on to, she said. Something I don't want to forget, he said. There's a difference. She thought about that. What's the difference? Holding on to is about keeping it. Not forgetting is about knowing it happened and carrying it forward. He put the panel in place. I don't want to forget what the cabin was before or what it took to make it what it is now. She was quiet for a moment. Marcus had a watch, she said. Stopped working the day he died. I had it repaired twice. Kept stopping at the same time. She paused. I wear it anyway. Not because I think it'll start working, because it was his, and it was on his wrist, and it was part of the day. And I want to know that when I look at my arm. He put his hand flat on the panel for a moment. Yeah, he said. Like that. They finished the paneling that afternoon. Roy came on Tuesday, said and left. Grant stood in the reconstructed north room with the new window, throwing a rectangle of October light across the floor, and looked at what the work had made. It looked like the cabin. Not exactly the same, not trying to be. The new wood was lighter than the aged timber in the rest of the structure. The roofline different. The window a new element altogether. It looked like a thing that had been broken and put back together with attention. You could see where it had been broken if you looked. He thought that was fine. He thought that was better, actually, than something that pretended the break hadn't happened. He asked her that evening, not with ceremony. Not with a production that would have been wrong for both of them, and that neither of them, would have wanted. They were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner with their coffee, the new window dark beyond the glass, the ridge invisible under the night sky, but present the way things were present when you knew their shape by memory. Ellie was in her room. She'd added 18 pages to the wildlife catalog since July, and had recently pivoted to a section on raptors that she was approaching with the comprehensive energy of a researcher who has found their next subject. I said I'd ask you something in the fall, Grant said. Camille set her mug down. He looked at her. The specific face of this specific person, not idealized, not the soft focus version of someone you were trying to impress, but the actual face, the one that went guarded when it was scared and went precise when it was working and went open. Sometimes in the particular way it had in the cabin in January, when the storm was doing its worst and the ordinary defenses had nothing to hold on to. "I'm not good at speeches," he said, "so I'm not going to make one." He reached into his coat, which was on the back of his chair, and took out a ring. Not a jeweler's box, not a velvet presentation. Just the ring, which he'd had for 3 weeks, chosen after 1 hour in a jewelry store in Durango, selected because it liked something that belonged on a real hand, living a real life, and not like an advertisement for a ring. "I want to marry you. I want Ellie to have you in her life the way you've been in it since February, as a permanent thing and not a question. And I want to find out what the next part looks like, which I expect will be difficult in some ways and worth it in all of them." Camille was looking at the ring, then at him. "That's actually a very good speech for someone who said they weren't making one," she said. "Don't tell anyone." She reached across the table and picked up the ring and looked at it in the light. It was a simple thing, warm gold with a single low-set stone, unpretentious, made to last rather than to impress. "Yes," she said. She put the ring on herself, which he'd somehow expected, and looked at it on her hand for a moment with the expression of someone receiving information and deciding what it meant. Then she looked at him. "You should know I'm still going to be bad at slowing down," she said. "I'm better than I was. I'm not fixed. I'm still going to be stubborn about the wrong things," he said. "And bad at asking for help. I know that about myself. We're going to fight about that. Probably more than once." "Okay," she said. "Good. I'd rather fight about real things than be careful about everything." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his, the new ring cool against his palm, and they sat at the table in the kitchen of the rebuilt cabin, and the night was completely quiet outside, except for the occasional low sound of the mountains settling into its cold, the way it did every October, patient and old and indifferent to everything except its own permanence. They heard Ellie's door open. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, with her drawing pad under her arm, the owl-related figurine that had come from Mrs. Paulson's the night of the storm tucked in her other hand, because Ellie traveled with objects the way other people traveled with anxieties. She looked at them sitting at the table. She looked at Camille's hand. "Is that a ring?" she said. "Yes," Camille said. Ellie came to the table and looked at it closely with the focused assessment of a naturalist examining something new. "Did my dad ask you, or did you ask him?" he asked me. Ellie looked at Grant. "Good," she said. "I told him to do it in September." He waited too long. Grant looked at his daughter. "You told me to do what in September?" to ask her. She said it with the patience of someone explaining something self-evident. "I didn't say ask what. You're smart. You could figure it out." She put her drawing pad on the table, sat down, opened it. "I've been waiting." Camille made a sound that was a real laugh. The kind with air in it. The kind he'd first heard in the cabin in part 2, when Ellie had said something sharp and true about not telling Grant he was right. And he thought, as he often thought, that there were very few things in his life that sounded better than that specific sound. "You could have told me," he said. "You needed to get there yourself." Ellie said, as if this were completely obvious, and began to draw. They were married the following August, on a Saturday, beside the cabin. 23 people. Not more. Grant did not know 23 people well enough to want all of them at his wedding, and Camille had learned over the past year that the version of her life she actually wanted was smaller and more specific than the version her professional life had required her to perform. They agreed on small without debate, which was itself a thing worth noting. Mrs. Paulson came in a yellow dress and told Grant he'd taken long enough, which was a theme. Roy the contractor came because Ellie had invited him, and because he seemed to feel a proprietary interest in the cabin that the occasion warranted. Grant's sister drove from Durango with her family. Dana Kowalski came from Denver and cried, which surprised Camille and also didn't. Ellie carried the rings. She had asked for this role with the same specification filing energy she'd applied to the window, and she took it seriously enough that she'd done a practice run at the cabin the previous morning that involved considerable deliberation about the pace of walking and the appropriate expression for the occasion. She had decided on serious, because this was serious, which was accurate. She wore a blue dress that she'd chosen herself and small boots she'd polished the night before. And she walked the 20 feet of mountain grass between where Grant stood and where Camille came from the cabin door with the gravity of someone carrying something irreplaceable, which she was. Grant watched his daughter walk toward him in the August morning light, the mountain behind the tree-lined green and enormous and permanent, and he thought about the night in January when he'd lain on the couch, listening to the cabin settle and wondering what he'd done by stopping on that road. And he thought about how wrong it was to try to calculate, in the moment of a decision, what the decision was going to mean. Couldn't see it from inside the moment. You could only see it from here, from August, from the other side of everything the year had been. He'd almost kept driving. He looked at Ellie handing the rings to the officiant with both hands, careful like she'd practiced. He looked at Camille standing in front of him in the morning light, not performing calm, just present, in the way she'd been present in the bedroom in January, with her arm around a sleeping child in the middle of the worst night he'd had in years. He thought, you make the best call you have the information for, and you commit. He had made a call in the dark on Route 9 with almost no information, and he had committed. The years that followed were not simple, because nothing real is simple, and anyone who tells you the hard part ends at the wedding is selling you a version of life that doesn't exist. Camille restructured her company formally in the spring. After the wedding, a transition that took 8 months, cost her 3 board relationships, and produced a version of Arden Systems that was measurably stronger, and that Dana ran with a competence that made Camille feel, in equal measure, proud and slightly absurd for having waited so long. She worked from the cabin 3 weeks out of 4 and went to Denver when Denver needed her, which was less often than she'd believed it would, and more often than Grant preferred. And both of those things were true at the same time, and they navigated them without pretending otherwise. Grant stayed with the county for 2 more years and then left to do independent contractor work, which paid less consistently and more overall, and which let him be home when Ellie got off the school bus, which had been the actual objective all along. He was better at asking for help than he'd been. Not good. Better. Camille learned to put the laptop away at 7, most nights. Not every night. Most. They argued about real things, as promised, and got reasonably efficient at apologizing without making the apology into a production. Ellie grew into herself the way children did when they had enough room and enough attention, both of which she had. She was 10 when she gave a presentation to her class about mustelid taxonomy that her teacher described, in a note to Grant, as thorough to a degree I am not sure I was prepared for. She was 12 when she informed them at dinner that she intended to be a wildlife biologist, which was not a surprise to anyone at the table. She had by that point filled 7 drawing catalogs and started an 8th. Still had the field guide. 3 years after the wedding, in the bedroom of the rebuilt cabin, a second daughter was born. They named her Clara Camille's Choice, and the name, when Grant said it for the first time holding the specific warm weight of a new person, sounded exactly right in a way names sometimes did and sometimes didn't. The cabin by then was full in the way it hadn't been since Catherine was alive, which was a thing Grant sat with rather than trying to resolve or explain. It was full, and it was different, and it was not a replacement of what had been full before, because it couldn't be, and he'd stopped needing it to be. Catherine was in the way she'd always been in Ellie's hands and mouth, and the specific way she tilted her head when she was thinking through something, in the photographs that were still on the wall, in the things Grant told both daughters about her, because he had decided years ago that she deserved to be known. Camille never asked him to take the photographs down. He never expected her to. One February morning, 3 winters after Clara was born, Grant stood at the new window, Ellie's window, the one facing east-northeast over the tree line, and watched snow come across Hollow Ridge. Not a blizzard. Just winter doing winter things, the snowfall soft and unhurried, the mountain its ordinary, extraordinary self. Clara was asleep in the next room. Camille was at the kitchen table with her laptop and a coffee, doing whatever it was she was doing, and the sound of her occasional keystrokes was part of the ambient sound of the cabin, the same way the wood stove and the wind and the creak of the structure were part of it. Ellie had her driver's permit now and had taken the truck to Mrs. Paulson's, which was an adjustment Grant was still, honestly, working through, because there were some things where the protective instinct didn't respond well to reason. He stood at the window and watched the snow. He thought about Catherine. He thought about the specific weight of her absence, which had not diminished but had changed its shape, settled into the structure of his life, the way the pine cones had settled into the wall. Held there, part of what the thing was made of. He thought about the road, about the 14-degree dark and the red flicker at the shoulder and the voice that said it wasn't his problem. He thought about what it actually meant to survive something. Not to come out clean, not to be repaired to factory condition, but to come through with the damage still visible and the structure still sound, and to find that the thing you'd built in response to the hardest years of your life was solid enough to hold more than you'd built it for. The snow came across the ridge and covered the tree line and settled on the new roof of the cabin, which was steep enough now to shed it cleanly. From the kitchen, Camille's voice, "The coffee's still hot, if you want some." Turned from the window. "Yeah," he said, "I'll be right there." He stood one more moment at the glass, at the mountain and the snow and the morning, at the specific ordinary beauty of a day that wasn't anything except what it was. Then he walked away from the window and into the warm kitchen and sat down with his wife, and the day went forward, unspectacular and irreplaceable, the way the best days always were.